Buenos días con todos, ya vamos a empezar. Ya tenemos a nuestro invitado. Solo unos minutos, por favor, y comenzamos. Buenos días con todos. Ya estamos listos para empezar. Bienvenidos todos de parte de Perú 2021 y UTEC. Presento ahorita a Micaela para empezar.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días. Muy buenos días. Es un gusto comenzar esta mañana con nuestra primera sesión estratégica virtual sobre supply chain que organiza Perú 2021 en alianza con la UTEC. Mi nombre es Micaela Rizopatrón, soy gerente general de Perú 2021 y esta sesión es parte de nuestro programa Generación del Cambio, que busca llevar con experiencias y herramientas relevantes la sostenibilidad a conectar con el eje central y estratégico de los negocios. Antes de comenzar, quería recordar algunas reglas de juego. Lo primero es que por favor mantengamos nuestros micrófonos apagados para no interrumpir la charla. En todo momento pueden hacer preguntas y comentarios a través del chat, cuyo acceso está abajo a la derecha de la pantalla. Adicionalmente, esta sesión está siendo grabada, por lo que podrán tener toda la información en la mano y la compartiremos por correo con todos los asistentes. Finalmente, les pido que al final de la sesión no olviden llenar una pequeña encuesta de retroalimentación para asegurar que estas sesiones sean cada vez mejores. Ahora sí, listos para comenzar. Les presento a José Antonio Larco, coordinador de Ingeniería Industrial de la UTEC, para que presente a nuestro expositor invitado. Espero tengamos una excelente sesión. José Antonio, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias, Micaela. Realmente estamos muy contentos que ustedes estén todos aquí. A pesar del poco tiempo hemos podido ver que de verdad hay un gran interés para escuchar al profesor Jean-François. Mi nombre es José Larco, yo soy coordinador de la carrera de Ingeniería Industrial en UTEC y tenemos toda una plataforma abierta justamente para ver cómo desde la academia nosotros podemos contribuir a resolver problemas para la sociedad, ¿no? En este caso, el tema del abastecimiento y las cadenas de suministro en general, ¿no? Entonces les presento ahora al profesor Jean-François. De hecho, yo trabajé con él en el pasado, ya por el 2010, 2011, en los Países Bajos, en la Universidad Técnica de Eindhoven, y ahora el profesor Jean-François es decano de investigación de la Universidad Kuhne Logistics University, KLU, en Hamburgo, Alemania, Él además es un experto y muy publicado, no solo en el ámbito académico, sino también en el ámbito empresarial, y todo lo que tiene que ver temas de cadenas de suministro, desde temas de puertos a temas de cadenas largas y justamente shocks como ¿no? Shocks de demanda. Y una particularidad que tiene el profesor Jean-François, y creo que lo hace muy relevante para nosotros, es que él ha estado muy cercano a la realidad latinoamericana, ¿no? Él ya previamente tenía una agenda de investigación por todo el lado de las bodegas, en toda Latinoamérica, incluyendo Perú, y entonces tiene una cercanía, ya ha venido bastantes veces a toda la región, inclusive a Perú también el año pasado, 2 veces. Entonces tiene cercanía bastante con la realidad y eso puede ayudar muchísimo, ¿no? Por favor, hagan todo lo que puedan de preguntas. Vuelvo a repetir lo que dijo Micaela, abajo en cuya pueden hacer todas sus preguntas y nosotros vamos a luego hacérselas al profesor Jean-François para contestar y resolver todas sus inquietudes. Van a haber bastantes minutos asociados para eso. Entonces, sin más, presento a mi gran amigo, el profesor Jean-François, para que comience la charla. Hi, Jan. Are you there?
Yes. Oops.
You're there. Great. Okay. Can you share your screen? Great. The floor is all yours, Jan. Thanks for being here.
To share some of the learnings that we have had over the past few months as the spread of the coronavirus has unfolded, starting in China and then later on here in Europe, and now has also reached Latin America. What I'll try to do today is sketch with you a bit of the development and some of the learnings that sort of have evolved over time, and also put this in a perspective from what we know from earlier crises. Right, this crisis is different from any of the earlier crises in terms of the global impact and in terms of the waves in which it unfolds. At the same time, there are also learnings that we can observe from previous crises and maybe combine them. So I will try to sketch this picture for you. Now, what is important to understand is that, first of all, we talk today about supply chain, but we should not forget this is, first of all, a global humanitarian crisis, right? There's thousands, tens of thousands, actually now hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed by the virus, and many people have very serious illnesses. Now, when these type of disasters happen, we tend to think, first of all, of the direct impact of the disaster in terms of the humanitarian impact, but there's actually also a follow-on impact due to government measures, right? So initially we see a crisis unfolding in the sense of people getting ill, people getting into the hospital, people dying, people maybe not being shown up for work. So the direct activities of the virus. But at the same time, we then also see that governments respond. And it's these government actions that in many cases have an even more bigger impact on the way we operate and the way we operate our supply chains. And I have over here two pictures from Latin America. On the right, we see in Honduras, actually the army doing distribution of food in the rural countryside. And on the left, we see actually a little bodega in Lima, where also many hygiene measures are being put into place. So government measures are being taken, and there's many government measures now in Latin America in place. We have just a few days ago, so it may not be completely up to date, made an inventory of the various measures across Latin America. So over here we see the countries in Latin America, and measures like sanitary emergency, suspension of bigger schools and bigger events, but also curfews. And in addition, on the right side, support for small, medium-sized enterprises. And if we focus on Peru, actually Peru is characterized by having all of these measures in place and also quite early. So in a sense, Peru is maybe an indicator of what is going to happen later on in other Latin American countries, because in terms of the strictness and the extent of the measures of the government and the speed by which this has been implemented, Peru has been really fast. And I think many of you will have experienced this over the past weeks, for better or for worse. Now, the way I would like to look at this corona supply chain is I will look at this as 6 phases in which this unfolds. So first, these are the supply shortages from abroad. So for most countries, with the exception of China, where this all started, this started first as a crisis far away. And this crisis far away leads to supplies that we maybe buy from far away, and that eventually normally reach us, but now don't reach us. Right? So this is the supply shortages from abroad. I will go through these phases in a bit more detail later on. Second, once the virus reaches us within our country, we see supply shortages domestically. For instance, because factories are forced to be closed, either due to shortage of workers, difficulty of transportation, but maybe also mandatory closures by the government because they're not deemed essential. Then, in many countries, there are very serious demand shifts. So at the consumer level, in particular, we see huge demand shifts taking place, many as a consequence of government measures, and I'll also give some examples and learnings. In many countries, we also face transportation restrictions. Governments implement lockdown measures as a way to limit the spread of the virus, but these lockdown measures are maybe targeted at people transportation, but as a collateral, they also have transportation restrictions for freight very often in place. And here in Europe, for instance, we have faced now border restrictions within the European Union that we have not seen for 30 years, because 30 years ago, our borders were opened within the EU. And now for the first time, most of these borders have been closed. Then in many supply chains, there are small suppliers and small retailers that actually are crucial for having these supply chains survive. They're typically not the ones that receive a lot of attention, but in terms of surviving the crisis and also being able to ramp up after the crisis, what we have learned from previous crises is that it's really critical that especially these critical small suppliers and retailers remain alive, because otherwise there will be great difficulties in ramping up afterwards. And then you may not think of that, but I think it's a good moment to think about this now. It may make sense, and it does make a lot of sense to already think about the ramp up right now, even though there's big insecurity as to when this may happen and in what shape this may, in what form it may take shape. I'll walk you through these different steps. Let me first look a bit back to actually now 2 months ago, sort of around the Chinese New Year, around the 1st of February. The virus started to emerge in China, and this led to factory closures. Initially in the start in Wuhan, where actually the core of the virus outbreak was, with workers reporting ill. But later on, very quickly, actually, the Chinese government instituted travel restrictions for migrant workers. And as many of the migrant workers were in their hometowns and not in the towns where the factories were, essentially this implies factories all over China could not start up. We saw this in China. Actually, we have seen similar things now happening here in Europe. I will talk about that there, and also now in the US, these type of observations can be made. This leads to factory closures, and if factory closes, it cannot produce, and then essentially their customers cannot get access to products. In China, for most of the month of February, there's been nearly a full closure across the countries of almost all factories not producing essential goods, with essential goods being medical goods, food, beverage, but most other goods were deemed non-essential, and these factories closed. And the ramp up in March has actually been very slow. Now we are at the beginning of April, and if I understand the reports, most factories are now in order of magnitude at about 80%, 80, of capacity. And if you are sourcing components or products from China, which I know many companies maybe that are manufacturing in China are doing, you should still be expecting problems with supply shortages from China over the coming weeks, because there is obviously delays due to transportation. In China, due to the restrictions and the quarantines, there was also a huge shortage of road capacity. So even for factories that were starting to produce, they had difficulty actually getting their products out to consumers or getting their products out to the port, because truck drivers were not allowed to travel from one province to the other due to the quarantine restrictions. So again, something which we take for a given. I think nowadays, in today's world, we sort of assume transportation capacity is available. Well, actually, it was a big challenge in China in the first quarter of this year. Then we had big problems in ocean capacity, partly due to the fact that ships could not moor in China because of quarantine restrictions, and the workers on the ship could not board the ships, or did not want to board for fear of health risks, but also due to container imbalances. Essentially, many empty containers having ended up in the wrong place across the globe, because services had been disrupted, many blank sailings, so ships that were not moving around. This problem is still there, and actually this is aggravated globally. So I know here in Europe, there are at the moment also shortages of containers in some places, surpluses in other places where empty containers are not needed. So this is a big challenge, and ocean carriers, they are trying to ship around empty containers to get them into the right position, but this is an issue. One of the news I heard last week is that now for export, for instance, of coffee from Latin America, there are challenges getting access to containers, and I would presume this could be the case also for other products that are dependent on export. And then finally, in terms of transport, also a shortage of air capacity. The fact that there was a shortage of products due to factory closures, and then a shortage of ocean capacity, so no shipment available, this led to shortages of products downstream. And many companies here in Europe initially, and in the US, they chose to air freight their components or products that they needed. But there was a huge shortage of air freight capacity because most passenger flights had been canceled already to China at that moment in time. And what many people don't realize is that most of the freight in this world actually is not going into specific freighter planes, but actually goes in the belly of passenger vehicles, right? This situation is still very much around, especially now that the scarce capacity that is there in air freight is mainly being used to supply medical emergency supplies. And it's very difficult actually to get air freight capacity for other products. And also it's very expensive. Now, if we move to Europe, if we move to Europe, in Europe, these effects only became visible, like in the US, and I'm sure also in Latin America, about 6 weeks later. Because it takes about 4 weeks to transport the goods. There's typically a couple of weeks of inventory. So this is when we then see things happening. So here in Europe, we saw factory closures initially happening due to part shortages from China. So we've seen, for instance, car factories closed because there were no parts available. And then factory closing because of local quarantines, because the virus had arrived here to Europe, and then local quarantines happening, initially in northern Italy, which is a very big manufacturing hub in Europe. Yeah, I think you may not realize this from Peru, but actually many parts for the automotive industry, they are being manufactured in northern Italy. So the German automotive industry and the French automotive industry actually had big issues with the supply of parts, critical parts from the north of Italy. Then also here in Europe, we saw a shortage of road capacity in some sectors, actually surpluses in others. But road capacity was short, for instance, in grocery, because the grocery demand increased a lot, not just of toilet paper, actually of all groceries. So shortage of capacity, but also in the long haul, we saw shortages because there were obstructions at the borders. And that means that lots of trucks were waiting in line to pass the border. So that effectively decreased the capacity of available freight. The shortage of ocean capacity is now building up. Actually, I should have taken out the likely. I put out this likely on this slide 3 days ago. But actually today, there is actually in some areas a shortage of ocean capacity happening, which is kind of odd, right? Because the exports are decreasing because factories are closed. But there is shortage of ocean capacity just because containers tend to be in the wrong locations. And the prices for air transportation are skyrocketing. Again, the question is for how long? I think this is because of the medical supplies, primarily at the moment. As soon as this medical supply situation gets under control, my expectation is that these air transportation prices, they could plummet, right? Because at that point, because demand has gone down, demand maybe for air capacity may also be there. This situation is now also developing in the US, and the first steps of that we also see in Latin America now. Now, a few comments on the small suppliers. Now, if you're a manufacturer in, I don't know, could be electronics industry, apparel, but also in consumer packaged goods, we tend to sort of take our second and third tier suppliers for granted. But actually, the second and third tier suppliers, this is where there's many of the problems occurring in the supply chain. Why is this? Well, first, beyond your first tier supplier, very often it's not so clear who are your suppliers further upstream. And these could be, even if you are having your first tier supplier within Peru, it could be that that supplier is sourcing parts from China, from the US, or from Europe, which could be affected by supply problems. Second, it's particularly the small suppliers that have a risk of going bankrupt. And if you don't have the visibility onto these smaller suppliers, and these suppliers are critical to provide you with parts or raw materials that you may need, this could influence the viability of your company. So it's really important, and of course, this is something that we tell everybody in all of our classes, and I'm sure Jose Antonio also teaches this at UTEC. If you're not in a crisis, you need to be aware of your critical suppliers. If you are aware, I'm sure you've taken all the right actions. However, what we do know is that many companies do not have a very good insight into these critical suppliers. And it does make sense right now to try and get a good idea beyond your first and second, beyond your first tier into second and third tier suppliers. And if necessary, if you identify that these suppliers are actually critical for you, maybe even provide financial help, such as paying invoices early or using fintech and means like reverse factoring. So that governs, I would say, many sectors, right? In terms of manufacturing sector, in terms of automotive, which I know is also present quite a bit in Peru. But also, for instance, apparel industry, because the apparel industry is dependent very often on fabric that is being imported from China. I don't know the current status there, but there could also be issues there. So moving from the supply side to the demand side, I can share with you a bit from our learnings here now. So we have first look at grocery. So what we see in grocery is really very big changes in the demand. First, there is the issue of the panic buying. And I think the panic buying received all of the attention everywhere. Particularly the toilet paper was in every newspaper. And I understand also Peruvians have stocked up on toilet paper. The experience from most countries is that the effect is very large, but also relatively short. So somehow manufacturers are able to live up to this change in demand. Here in the Netherlands, to show you a reference number, we saw about 33% increase. Jose Antonio shared with me some numbers from Peru, where it was maybe plus 50%, the panic buying. So I guess Peruvians may be a bit more Latin in the way the emotions are in terms of responding. But in that sense, only 50% more Latin than the Dutch, right? We still had a 30%, 33% increase. So maybe we're actually mentally closer to you than what you might think normally. Short-lived. Then the second thing is there is a demand shift. So not related to panic, but because the restaurants are closed in most places. Also, many people are working from home rather than working in the office. This actually implies there is also a shift from people eating out of home to people preparing their meals at home. And that shift is a shift in channel. Here in the Netherlands, this shift has been about 17%. That is a persistent shift. This is going to stay for as long as the quarantine measures are there, right? Again, this would need to be estimated for every country specifically, right? It relates to whether the schools are closed, where people would eat normally, how many people normally would eat out of the house, etc. But essentially, the calories consumed out of home, they are now being consumed in the home. And that computation essentially leads to a change in grocery. Then, for many products, there is a shift from in-store to online. Especially, of course, in countries where non-essential stores have been closed. But even in the Netherlands, where non-essential stores have not been closed, so many stores are still open, there is a shift. The overall shift in volume is limited because just the growth of the delivery capacity is not available. So there's a limit of capacity into how much can be delivered to home. I can imagine that in Peru, the Rappis and the Glovos, they may take on part of this, but in specific segments. What we see here in Europe is that some segments have seen huge growth. For instance, a segment like luxury goods or electronics for facilitating homework. So specific segments, they see a lot of growth. Other segments, it's not so much visible. Fourth, and this makes a link to the manufacturers supplying to retailers. We have seen quite a few suppliers and retailers that reduce the assortment. So if you stop making slow movers, and just focus on the fast movers. Actually, this increases the capacity of and the efficiency of the channel because I have less changeovers in my plans. And also, let's say the retail chain becomes more efficient if I have a smaller assortment, right? So this is happening. And finally, and I probably should take this first, it's really important to ensure that your workers continue to be available, because in the end, if you're in retail and the workers are not there anymore, you also cannot sell. So many protective measures have been put in place, like for instance, as you see here, the plexiglass screens in front of the cashiers at the supermarkets. In medical supplies, different sector, again, major shortages, both in the hospitals and in retail. And in most countries now, actually the government takes control of the medical supply and does the allocation, prioritizing this. Many problems. So this relates to medicines, for instance, anesthesia medicines, because many more are needed, protective equipment for healthcare workers, ventilators, more or less the same thing you see across the globe right now. From a supply chain perspective, very difficult to resolve because the increase in demand is so high that it's almost impossible for manufacturers to follow. Actually, maybe one comment. So one of my colleagues has looked at ad hoc supply chains. So you see in some of these sectors now that manufacturers are changing. So for instance, apparel manufacturers who are maybe producing t-shirts or other shirts are now shifting to making medical protective equipment. And I can imagine that this might also happen in Peru. I don't know that current situation. In other retail, we see a shift to online, mandatory closures, but also some sectors where demand really drops to zero. And here's the automotive. I think we saw in China initially already the numbers, a drop of 95% in demand. I don't have the European numbers here, but my guess is these are similar numbers. And we'll probably also see this in Latin America happening. So certain markets just completely stop functioning. And this obviously has an effect on the suppliers and manufacturers supplying these markets. Moving into logistics. If we look at primary distribution, so not the retail distribution, but anything in terms of primary distribution between facilities, we see that at the delivery and pickup locations, there are many additional hygiene measures. So drivers face additional hygiene measures at these locations, and this leads to additional waiting times at the locations. In Europe, we have numbers collected where this is about 50% additional waiting time. Now, obviously, this impacts the capacity, right? Because if drivers have to wait longer at these locations, this is essentially time that they cannot spend moving the truck. I understand this is also the case in Peru. The borders, I already mentioned this. This is a picture of the German-Polish border. Huge waiting times over there because of additional inspections. The border is not formally closed for trucks. It's only closed for passenger vehicles. That's why you don't see any passenger vehicles in this picture. But the truck drivers, they're all being checked for their health. So this leads to delays. And then finally, and I think this is a very important thing also in terms of the government, is that many facilities for drivers have been closed, like toilets, showers, or also roadside restaurants. And this impacts, again, the capacity. So some countries, now the government is taking ownership to make sure that these type of facilities remain available. In secondary distribution, so moving out closer to the consumer, we see that the risk of infection of the workers is sort of the biggest concern. And that means that in distribution centers, we see strict zoning of workers, as in no contact between zones, also separate shifts, completely separated without any contact, and maybe even spreading products across multiple locations. In distribution routes, so this is in micro distribution in developing countries. On the left, you see in Africa, hygiene measures being taken in place. This is actually an example from Peru, where produce markets have been decentralized to limit the amount of contact. And also we see here in Europe retailers promoting cashless payments to avoid any contact, because the cash itself can also spread the virus. Specifically in Latin America, we see also the bodegas having all types of creative measures to avoid the contact taking place. And also, as we see, for instance, here in India, this being implemented on the street because not so many consumers can enter the store. So waiting needs to be outside the store. Now, if we move now towards the ramp up, and in terms of planning this, and you are a supply chain manager responsible for a manufacturing supply chain, for a chemical supply chain, for ocean container transport, many of you are upstream in the supply chain, so you're further away from the consumer. This typically implies that you have very limited visibility of what's going on in your supply chain. This implies that if we move towards a ramp up, that the effect of demand changes will be delayed. So if a consumer starts to buy more, it will take several weeks before you actually observe this in your supply chain. Second, what we know is that there will be an amplification of demand, right? Because there's overreaction. Once the demand increase starts, there will be overreactions of people ordering. And we have learned from this after the recovery from the credit crisis. This is one of the learnings that we think we will see again in this recovery. So after the Lehman crisis, when the demand increase happened and the demand decreases happened, we saw this aggravated effect. So for instance, here, these are data we collected in late 2008, early 2009, where Philips Electronics, they saw their sales decline according to the blue curve. But in terms of their ordering to suppliers, actually, they ordered less, right? And this happened also at a larger scale between retail and manufacturing in the US. So whatever you see in terms of demand decrease upstream, if you're an automotive manufacturer, this will be even worse than what's happening at the retail level. The further you are from the market, the further your demand drop will be. But also reversely, at the moment the ramp up starts, you're likely to be responding faster. So that means that everybody now needs to think about, well, what is going to happen in the ramp up and how can we prepare for this already now? Although this may be 1, 2, 3 months out, and although we're going to see what we expect for about 2 years, instabilities in terms of demand, because everything is out of sync. So in terms of the ramp up, again, I think we can learn from what we have seen in Lehman, because at that time, as growth started to come out in 2010, many companies were seeing a much higher increase in their demand than what they were anticipating. So just like you see now a much higher decrease, a much more impactful decrease, you're likely at some point to see also a higher increase than what you may anticipate. Of course, the million-dollar question is when is this going to happen, right? We don't know this. I can't give you this answer. What I do know is that this is not traditional forecasting. So your sales over the past months or years, there are not going to be any indication of your ramp up coming up. What you need to build now is insight. what is my downstream supply chain status? What is my upstream supply chain status? What are the inventories? Are my suppliers or my customers still alive? Is there transport available? And I think the second thing is you really need to have a very good understanding of what delays are there between you and the final consumer in the market. And these delays could be a month, but for some, if you're a chemical manufacturer, we've worked with chemical manufacturers here, these delays can be 6 months, right? And this is an understanding that you need to have to be able to get a further analysis of when your demand may ramp up. Oops, the other way around. Once you have that insight, it is possible to get some idea. And these were models we built after the Lehman wave when demand did go down. At some point went up again, and we were able to make a reasonably good prediction of the dynamics occurring there. And I'm sure that at UTEC they would have the knowledge to build these type of models also, because this knowledge has been spread now. So to sort of move towards a conclusion, and in terms of what you can do now, apart from all the different things that I said in terms of understanding what's going on, is how can we prepare for the ramp up? So first, I think it's really important to treat your workers well and keep them on board. If you're able to, if your finances allow this, I think this is an opportunity to create loyalty and make sure you're ready for the ramp up. Second, as I've already indicated, it's really important to know the status of your supply chain. Where are the inventories? What is the status of your suppliers? And think specifically of small critical suppliers, because they are the ones that likely can stop you to ramp up. I talked a few weeks ago to a company that was preparing for a ramp up, and they discovered that there was some small supplier in China that had actually an item which they thought was non-critical, but that was no longer available. So these are stories that are really scary, because if you think you're ready and then you discover that maybe you cannot get chargers or other simple items or cloth, this may actually cause challenges. Then, if you have cash, we know that particularly some large companies, they have been doing really well in the past 3-4 years because the economy was strong. At this point, many shareholders are not expecting dividends. So here in Europe, for instance, most shareholders have stated that they don't expect dividend, and they expect larger companies to use the money that they would have paid to pay out the dividend to really make sure their supply chain stays alive. And I think it makes sense to ensure you have inventory. We know the ramp up will come. Again, I'm not able to tell you when. I'm not able to tell you if this is going to be 1, 2, or 3 months after the lockdown measures get gradually released. But for instance, to look at some hopeful remarks, over here in Europe now, Austria, the Czech Republic, and probably also Germany, they announced that they're going to release some of the strictness of the lockdown, right? But it's been about a month, 6 weeks. And these countries have been doing really well, and they're gradually, not all of a sudden, very carefully, but gradually releasing some of the restrictions. And that will lead to an increase in demand. You better be ready, because I think first movers will have an advantage. Also, if you build up inventory, it helps keep your suppliers alive, right? Don't forget about this, because your supplier may not have the cash. If you don't have the cash, so if you're short of cash, then you need to focus on survival. And that means reduce cash spending, so non-critical spending, and maybe reduce your inventory, right? It will put you at a disadvantage, I'm really sure, but if you don't survive, you're not going to be there at all. Fifth, I think it's important to start thinking about securing transport capacity and critical supplies. Right now, transport capacity in certain sectors is scarce everywhere. And if the ramp up happens, I expect it will be also scarce in certain sectors, not everywhere. In other sectors, there could be huge surpluses. But in the first ramp up, I expect, even if the ramp up is small, that there could be shortages in transport supply. In addition, specifically for Latin America, we could run into a situation in which unemployment may increase quite a bit. This typically leads to civil unrest and additional security risks. Again, in that period, we know that transport capacity will be affected. And finally, I think it makes sense to think about, well, which long-term demand shifts could there be in my supply chain? This could be in a consumer perspective, it could be in a product perspective, it could be in a channel perspective, it could be that your clients have disappeared. We know from previous crises in Latin America, for instance, that there's been a huge channel shift to bodegas, to traditional retail, because many people that have just been able to make the middle class previous to the crisis will end up again in the lower middle class or among the poor later, and they may have to shift their buying behavior. Finally, with this, I would like to conclude my introduction for now and give the floor back to Jose Antonio to follow up, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Muchas gracias, Jan. Voy a hacer una presentación un poquito corta. La verdad, lo único que quería hacer era, voy a hacer un pequeño resumen de algunos puntos que tocó Jan en castellano y poder de repente incidir algunos puntos que quizá en Perú son un poquito más significativos o quizá cobran mayor relevancia. Y segundo, voy a proponer una pequeña idea corta sobre qué rol pueden tener sobre todo las empresas de bienes de consumo masivo y también retailers o tiendas, incluyendo las bodegas, en poder de alguna manera disminuir el riesgo de exposición y de contagio. Entonces, bueno, empezamos. Bueno, como saben, soy el coordinador de la carrera de Ingeniería Industrial, y entonces comienzo un poco a resumir algunos puntos importantes de la charla de Jan. Primero se habló un poquito de las fases que existen en la disrupción, en esta crisis humanitaria, que obviamente tiene consecuencias para la cadena de suministro, pero principalmente es una crisis humanitaria, ¿no? Entonces, inclusive en Asia ahora, al inicio por supuesto hubo el problema de compras de pánico, también hubo el problema de muchas personas enfermas y simplemente problemas de demanda, ¿no? Lo que es interesante es que hasta ahora en Asia existen restricciones de transporte y personas todavía que se reportan enfermas. Por lo tanto, todavía la capacidad para lograr suministrar sigue siendo limitada, ¿no? En Europa hubo sobre todo compras de pánico, pero acá creo, y estaba en 33%. En América Latina, bueno, tenemos alguna evidencia, un poco de anécdota de algunos retailers que nos dicen que algunas demandas llegaron a 50% más en el mes de marzo, en algunos productos como papel higiénico o cuidado personal. Y en general de toda la tienda, en realidad 50%, en realidad en papel higiénico, etcétera, fue más del doble, ¿no? Pero 50% más en alimentos y cuidado personal. Esto tiene que ver un poco con nuestra percepción del riesgo, pero lo que es importante entender acá es que esto es de poca duración. Eso es súper importante entenderlo. O sea, si bien hay compras de pánico, estas compras de pánico no son algo que esperemos que se mantenga por mucho tiempo. De hecho, pueden haber, ya poniendo un poco en el contexto peruano, cada vez que existen algunos nuevos anuncios o restricciones, como en el caso de Semana Santa, ocurren, ¿no? Estos lanzamientos de compras de pánico. Pero para nosotros, para los proveedores, lo único que podemos ver es que cada vez que existe un feriado, por ejemplo, 1 de mayo, por ejemplo, es una fecha que de todas maneras hay que prepararse. Uno puede prepararse un poquito hacia previo, pero no es un efecto que es duradero. Es muy importante tener. Bueno, en Europa también, volviendo de nuevo a Europa, hubieron problemas de suministro oceánico, porque líneas simplemente pararon, el movimiento de barcos paró en muchos sitios, o porque en algunos casos había mucha capacidad, pero esa capacidad no estaba en los lugares correctos, ¿no? En los países correctos, en los puertos correctos. Y eso genera restricciones de transporte, que vamos a hablar después. Un tema muy importante, Jan hablaba de second tier, third tier suppliers. Nosotros lo vemos como proveedores de segundo o tercer nivel, o para ponerlo un poquito más en castellano simple, son mis proveedores de mis proveedores. Y este punto es muy importante porque ha ocasionado sobre todo problemas en Europa y también en Latinoamérica, en términos de que muchos de nosotros no sabemos quiénes son estos proveedores de nuestros proveedores, y muchas veces somos muy vulnerables como cadena por fallas en estos proveedores de segundo o tercer nivel, ¿no? Los proveedores de mis proveedores. De hecho, esto se debe primero, puede ser, por ejemplo, cuando son proveedores pequeños, estos proveedores de mis proveedores, empresas pequeñas, puede haber problemas de falta de liquidez. En Perú, de hecho, hablando un poco con algunos contactos aquí, sí está pasando, por ejemplo, que inicialmente cuando el Estado pone estas restricciones de solo eh, las empresas críticas de alimentos y farmacia van a funcionar, pasa que sus proveedores, tanto de bienes como de servicios también, pueden fallar. ¿Por qué? Porque no están mapeados inicialmente por el gobierno y hay que tener permisos especiales. Y tener esa gestión de permiso especial toma también un tiempo, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, inclusive ahora todavía no todos esos proveedores están mapeados y puede generar disrupciones, ¿no? Finalmente, muchos de los proveedores son materias primas básicas, y por lo tanto de repente depende de flujos extranjeros. Es decir, dependemos de lo que viene de China o de Europa y dependemos de barcos, ¿no? Y que a veces está limitado todavía esa capacidad. Otro tema que pasa mucho en Asia, en Europa, una de las principales acciones que se ha hecho es el tema de proteger a los trabajadores, darles flexigras, es decir, mascarillas. Acá en Perú se ha hecho también temas de movilidad, es decir, utilizar buses para poder tener trabajadores que se mueven hacia los centros de distribución o hacia las fábricas. Y eso es importante porque un tema que pasa en países en desarrollo como en Perú es que no necesariamente todas las fuerzas del orden, le hace policía, serenazgo, etcétera, dado que esto es un tema muy dinámico, interpretan la ley de la misma manera. Y a veces los trabajadores, a pesar de tener salvoconducto, igual tienen restricciones. Y si estos trabajadores tienen funciones clave, realmente todo se cae, ¿no? Después, en términos de demanda, tenemos que algunas cosas, aparte de lo obvio de alimentos y de farmacia, que digamos ha habido una demanda más por pánico, hay también unas demandas extraordinarias en términos de aparatos electrónicos. Y creo que una recomendación de Ian en este aspecto es para toda la gente retailer es pensar en todos aquellos suministros que se necesitan para vivir bien y trabajar en casa. Porque, por supuesto que se espera que en los próximos meses vamos a pasar más tiempo ahí. Pero hay otros sectores, como el de los automóviles, como la demanda puede llegar a ser cero, y es el efecto opuesto, ¿no? Y tenemos que saber dónde estamos. Otro tema es, existen medidas en Europa y también en el mundo en desarrollo para limitar contagios. Efectivamente, las fábricas, también en los centros de distribución y en los supermercados, existe el tema de separar turnos para evitar contacto de gente, separar a los trabajadores de los clientes, y usar métodos electrónicos de pago para no tener tanto contacto mano a mano, ¿no? Un punto importante que tiene que ver con modelamiento, y nos encanta hacer eso también en UTEC, como dijo Jan, es que si tenemos la cadena de suministro, para aquellos proveedores que están más lejos del consumidor final, lo que se espera es que ahora que hay una caída en la demanda, esa caída en la demanda real sea percibida para estos proveedores de los proveedores de manera mucho mayor, mucho más significativa. Es decir, la caída, Jan habló un poco del ejemplo de Philips, donde la caída era por el tema de la crisis financiera en el 2008, la caída era seria, pero había un efecto multiplicador cuando uno se iba hacia los proveedores de los proveedores, ¿no? Pero esas son las malas noticias, ¿no? La caída de la demanda es menor, pero, es mayor, pero la buena noticia para este tipo de proveedores de los proveedores es que son los primeros también que se van a reactivar. Así como son los primeros en caerse en esta crisis, también probablemente son los primeros en reactivarse. O sea, cuando necesitamos construir inventario para poder vender. Otro tema que acá he subrayado acá en negrita es el tema de que la necesidad, o sea, estamos en una demanda, en una situación bien incierta, no tenemos mucha idea, existen algunos escenarios de la duración de la crisis y cómo se van a ir relajando progresivamente esta crisis. Y cómo también se va a ir reactivando la demanda en ciertos sectores. Entonces, ya un poco su mensaje, y yo quiero acá enfatizarlo mucho, porque nuestra tendencia humana es mucho hacia predecir. Queremos tener, cuando tenemos una situación desconocida, queremos tener esa bola de cristal que nos diga qué es lo que va a suceder, qué es lo que va a pasar en el futuro. Pero en realidad, lo que sí podemos hacer más que predecir es prepararnos. Y prepararnos va con cosas muy sencillas, como por ejemplo, averiguar quiénes son los proveedores de mis proveedores, y especialmente aquellas empresas que son pequeñas, porque son probablemente las más vulnerables, ¿no? Saber qué capacidad tenemos extra, si tenemos gente que podemos usar de manera rápida para tener una capacidad adicional de manera rápida, qué inventarios tenemos, ¿no? Entonces, todo esto es para prepararnos ¿para qué? Para el reinicio, ¿no? O sea, ya han hablado de este término ramp up. Para los que no saben, ramp up significa, es como prender de nuevo el carro, es como, obviamente después de esta crisis progresivamente vamos a ir prendiendo ese carro, prendiendo el funcionamiento, y tenemos que estar muy preparados para ese ascenso de nuevo en la cadena, ¿no? De la demanda. Entonces ahí las recomendaciones de Jan van primero, sobre todo el tema de proteger a los trabajadores, aparte de las medidas que mencionó Jan de separación de la gente, de protección, de equipos de protección personal, de mascarillas, de limpieza, etcétera. También hay medidas que pueden ser como, por ejemplo, movilidad. Yo sé que eso es caro, pero existen empresas ya en Perú que lo están haciendo para facilitar que los trabajadores, por ejemplo, lleguen a tiempo cuando haya restricciones de horarios, por ejemplo, toques de queda. Segundo, el saber cómo está configurada nuestra cadena, quiénes son nuestros proveedores, y dónde están estos inventarios. ¿Cuántos inventarios tenemos disponibles para abastecer la reactivación de la demanda? Jan cree que para aquellas empresas que tienen efectivo, es decir, flujo de caja, pueden existir oportunidades de primer movimiento. Es decir, el primero que juega, porque tiene existencia, porque tiene caja, puede comprar cierto inventario para para anticiparse a las primeras demandas que posiblemente se reactiven, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Porque es el primero que logró satisfacer la demanda, mientras que otros no pudieron, ¿no? Estamos hablando de quizá cierto tipo de alimentos que ya no son tan básicos y que quizás se reactiven una vez pasada la crisis, ¿no? O otro tipo de industrias donde comienza, por ejemplo, temas de laptops, temas electrónicos, es posible que se reactive porque la gente igual va a seguir trabajando en casa, ¿no? Entonces, el primero que tenga efectivo para comprar inventario para hacer eso, tiene una ventaja. Y bueno, hay esperanza, no sabemos, el punto es, ¿por qué preparar más que predecir? Es porque, si bien no sabemos cuándo va a ser el reinicio de las operaciones, el punto es que sabemos que va a haber un reinicio, ¿no? Y esto ya está ocurriendo, existen países como Austria, República Checa, que comienzan justamente ya a relajar las restricciones y poco a poco, de manera muy cuidadosa, comienzan a hacer el reinicio de la economía, ¿no? Pero, sin embargo, también puede suceder que como empresa no tengamos una posición cómoda de efectivo. En ese caso es muy, muy crucial cuidar el inventario y hacer todo lo posible para cuidar el efectivo, ¿no? Este tipo de oportunidades del primer jugador son más bien para empresas grandes o empresas medianas que tengan disponibilidad de efectivo. Para empresas pequeñas puede ser que esto no sea lo contrario, ¿no? Es necesario más bien cuidar el efectivo y ser mucho más cautos, ¿no? Otra predicción de Jan es que es importante que en las empresas medianas, grandes, operadores logísticos, estén pensando en temas de cómo asegurar la capacidad de transporte interoceánico, porque se prevé que van a haber muchas restricciones, o sea, la demanda va a incrementarse a un ritmo mayor que la capacidad de transporte interoceánico, sobre todo porque van a estar, la capacidad de este transporte está desigual en diferentes sitios, no están ubicados en los puertos que deben estar, etc. Para Latinoamérica y países emergentes, y quizá también, quién sabe, también en Europa puede pasar, un riesgo que es importante mapear es el tema del desempleo, y que eso puede generar, de hecho, problemas de protestas, ¿no? Y protestas, como bien sabemos en Perú, somos expertos en esto, significan carreteras, bloqueadas y sistemas de transporte bloqueados. Y es esperable que esto ocurra y de alguna manera tenemos que tener en cuenta que necesitamos tener algún inventario para cubrir esto, ¿no? Finalmente, es importante reflexionar qué efectos de largo plazo pueden ocurrir en nuestras cadenas. Por ejemplo, si es que creemos que ciertos cambios de demanda estructural pueden pasar, la gente va a pedir de repente más online ciertos pedidos en supermercados. Es importante pensar si eso puede ocurrir a largo plazo o no. O también, por ejemplo, si es que como esta crisis puede venir en diferentes olas, puede haber un tema de reconfigurar la cadena y tener proveedores que estén más cerca a casa, ¿no? Más, dentro de Perú inclusive, ¿no? Una cosa ya de mi cosecha, que creo que ya iba a hablar, pero no iba a hablar. Es importante a nivel de cadena de suministro de organización tener un equipo de manejo de crisis. Sobre todo, o sea, ¿qué pasa? Las noticias que están sucediendo en Perú se revelan de manera dinámica. Y eso significa, y es muy importante que esté un área legal, un representante legal y recursos humanos ahí, con la gente de cadena de suministro. Porque estos realmente generan de una manera restricción y posibles disrupciones, ¿no? Finalmente, creo, esto ya es algo personal, yo creo que las operaciones de retail, consumo masivo, pueden apoyar y pueden aportar en esta crisis para reducir la exposición al contagio. Yo creo que una cosa que deben tener como objetivo los supermercados, inclusive las bodegas, los mercados también de barrio, y también los proveedores de estos supermercados y mercados, es tratar de lograr una menor frecuencia de visitas. Es decir, que la gente tenga que ir más esporádicamente a estos establecimientos y que estas visitas cuando se den sean de menor duración. Nuestras operaciones tienen que rediseñarse más hacia esos dos objetivos, ¿no? Y el principal concepto que tenemos que entender acá es que la demanda de la mayoría de productos de primera necesidad es constante en realidad. Si bien pueden haber fluctuaciones a largo plazo, en semanas, es de manera constante. Entonces la necesidad para visitar los mercados, salvo temas de efectos de pánico, en realidad es regular, es constante. Entonces, una cosa que sabemos por teoría de inventarios, esto es un clásico inventarios 101, es que nosotros podemos de alguna manera controlar, si yo controlo la frecuencia, este es el inventario en el tiempo, y cada vez que me reabastezco sube el inventario. Las personas, cada familia en nuestras casas, esto normalmente hablamos de inventarios para empresas, ¿no? Pero lo interesante acá es que tenemos que pensar en inventarios del consumidor. Es decir, yo me reabastezco de alimentos, por ejemplo, de primera necesidad. Entonces, cada vez que yo voy al supermercado o a la bodega, yo me reabastezco, y luego hay una demanda de mi consumo, y luego me vuelvo a reabastecer. Si yo logro que este pedido sea más largo, por ejemplo, el doble, si yo logro comprar más, puedo hacer que que pueda yo, de alguna manera, ir menos veces al supermercado. Y entonces reducir de alguna manera la exposición al contagio. Y entonces pueden haber algunas ideas para mitigar esto. De hecho, sabemos que si tenemos la frecuencia de que vamos al supermercado versus nuestro inventario en soles, digamos, de lo que compramos, sabemos que nuestro inventario dramáticamente baja conforme vamos pidiendo más. Entonces lo que tenemos que hacer es pedir menos y tener más inventario. Pero tenemos unas restricciones. Primera restricción, es solo el 50% de los hogares en Perú tiene refrigerador. Y eso es un problema, porque por eso es que vemos muchas colas en zonas populares como el Caraballo, etc. Porque se esfuerzan a comprar de manera más frecuente. Y segundo, el problema de carga y de manipuleo, que es básicamente si tenemos un carrito de supermercado o una caja, ¿cómo cargamos las cosas? Y por supuesto el tema de la perecibilidad. No todos los productos son perecibles. Entonces, ¿qué podemos hacer como operaciones? Uno, para atacar el tema de perecibilidad, lo que podemos hacer es, por ejemplo, informar al público en las bodegas, en los supermercados, sobre aquellos alimentos que duren más. Aquellos alimentos básicos que puedan durar más en el refrigerador o que sean menos perecibles. Entonces, en fruta, por ejemplo, podemos escoger manzanas, porque tienen menor perecibilidad. Podemos tener una dieta más basada en conservas, como atún, o tallarines. Podemos tratar de influenciar un poco la demanda hacia productos que sean menos perecibles. Segundo, una cosa que pueden hacer las bodegas y los supermercados es tratar de tener ciertos recipientes o cajas para ayudar a la gente a que tengan formas de llevarse los productos a casa. Inclusive, en algunos casos se podría tener, por ejemplo, para los carritos un pequeño DNI, uno da el DNI, recibe el DNI cuando uno regresa el carrito. ¿Para qué? Para que la compra pueda ser en mayor volumen y de alguna manera visitar menos el supermercado. Finalmente, nuestras operaciones dentro de tienda, esto es válido para supermercados, tiendas de conveniencia y bodegas, es rediseñar el layout. Tratar de que de alguna manera la gente entre y salga más rápido de ese supermercado. Poner los productos de primera necesidad mucho más cerca de las cajas para de alguna manera evitar mayor permanencia, ¿no? Unas ideas un poquito más audaces son inclusive generar o armar canastas básicas de ciertos productos donde la gente puede ir, comprar, simplemente recogerlos, independientemente de internet, simplemente algunas canastas básicas donde la gente siempre va y compra una canasta básica de la semana. Y finalmente, yo creo que si bien esto en tiempos normales es menos dable, yo creo que sí hay esto es una cola típica en Lima, que ni siquiera se ve en el supermercado, y para evitar un poco la descongestión, las bodegas, están los puntos azules, pueden servir un rol. Es posible que exista cierta cooperación de los supermercados con bodegas de barrio, de alguna manera para poder centralizar también las operaciones. Creo que los tiempos críticos pueden ayudar a que este tipo de cooperación suceda. Y eso sería todo. Muchísimas gracias. Ahora vamos a proceder a leer las preguntas. Micaela, te doy para comenzar a leer las preguntas.
Muchas gracias, José. Hola, Jan, volvemos. Tenemos una mezcla de 5 preguntas que hemos juntado con los comentarios, tanto por Facebook Live como por el chat del Zoom, y las hemos juntado, como digo, en 5. Son complejas porque varias son de proyección de cómo va a ser, y como dijeron, no tenemos una bola mágica, pero esperamos que Jan pueda hacer lo posible en aliviar esta necesidad de predecir el futuro. Aquí va, las leeré en inglés primero y luego en castellano. Okay. Listo. Okay. So, Jan, ready.
Yes.
With all the new health protocols implemented and to be implemented in the different instances in the supply chain, and even more on the last mile delivery, would you consider that the impact on costs and times will be much greater and therefore it should be there where innovation could be a fundamental key in the future. I'll read it in Spanish now. Con todos los nuevos protocolos de salud implementados en las diferentes instancias de la cadena de suministro y aún más en la entrega de la última milla, consideraría que el impacto en los costos y los tiempos será mucho mayor y por lo tanto debería ahí desarrollarse un mayor trabajo de innovación, ya que podría ser una clave fundamental en el futuro.
Yes, I think it's a very good question. I think there are both sort of medium term, but maybe also longer term effects there. Because it may very well be that this physical distancing protocol, even after alleviation of the measures, would be in place maybe for a year or maybe even longer. And over here already some people have coined the term the 1.5 meter economy, which would be a new way of sort of designing our economy such that people are able to keep this distance, right? Now, let me give a few examples. So, for instance, I think in distribution centers, I think at this stage over here, what we are seeing is that the workers within the distribution center also need to keep the distance, right? This at the moment, without redesigned processes, this leads to a loss in efficiency, because this implies pickers, they cannot be too close to each other, where actually the place has been designed that they need to be close. Now, if this is going to be around for longer term, I am very sure that this will drive innovation, because you cannot have this situation where essentially your productivity goes down by maybe 30-40% because of this measure. So that will lead to redesign in the warehouses, where maybe not the full productivity loss can be recovered, but I'm sure we'll see the redesign of work processes, maybe a combination of automation and workers in smarter locations, maybe spreading out workers across the distribution center, etc. Another example, and there was a specific question also about last mile distribution. We know that particularly if you talk about the distribution both in e-commerce and in distribution to bodegas, that cash still plays a very important role. Now, cash leads in the virus situation to additional opportunities for contagion, right? So this should be a main driver for hygiene reasons to actually move to digitization of payments. Now, if this happens, this could potentially actually lead to more logistics efficiency, because we know from our research that actually maybe 30% or so of the time gets lost due to the fact that there's so much cash in the supply chain. So this is then an example where actually the hygiene measures, if this is a trigger to move to more use of digital payments, would actually lead to an innovation that leads to a structural improvement, right? So there it's actually an opportunity. And I'm convinced that in the different stages of the supply chain, we will see more of this. I think particularly with regard to digitization at the transaction points in the supply chain, this could be a trigger. This could be a trigger to have this moved faster.
Thank you. Next question is also related to cash. So in moments where cash and accounts receivable will dominate the near horizon, during the ramp up, is it advisable to focus efforts, resources, time, and even quick investments on the sales and distribution areas rather than on the productive areas? Spanish. En momentos donde el efectivo y las cuentas por cobrar dominarán el horizonte cercano, durante la aceleración, es aconsejable concentrar los esfuerzos, recursos, tiempo e incluso inversiones rápidas en las áreas de ventas y distribución en lugar de las áreas productivas?
I think it's hard to give a general answer, right? Because it depends a lot on your situation. If you have plenty of inventory, of course, this makes sense because you want to generate cash by then selling out your inventory. What I would plea for is for anybody in the ramp up situation is to really approach this with an interdisciplinary team across the silos. Because I think the big risk in the ramp up is assuming that in most cases the supply chain is disrupted. So there's going to be maybe surpluses of some inventories, shortages of others. Some factories that are maybe able to start production again, others that are not. So if then you send out your sales force to go flat out with promoting the sales of everything that you're normally selling, it could actually hit back to you. So I would plead for really planning this, for planning what you're going to push during the sales, during the ramp up. Maybe also this strategy that I've seen now here in terms of high demand could also work in the periods of the ramp up, like reducing your assortment a little bit. Over here, also some of the electronics companies, since there's so much demand now for electronics, they have actually cut all of the promotions because they don't want to further inflate the demand and disappoint even more customers, right? So this requires a very close collaboration between the sales function and the supply chain. And I think now is the time. I think in the coming month or so will be, for many companies, actually a relatively quiet period. For some, it will be a very hectic period, but there will also be companies that are relatively quiet because they're partially closed down, not operating. This is the moment to develop and design your interdisciplinary ramp-up strategy.
Wonderful, thanks. So next question is a bit more general. Should supply chain management shift to have a stronger focus on providers, on suppliers closer to the production sites, so we can be ready if this happens again? So, ¿recomiendas que la reconfiguración de la cadena con proveedores se acerque más al punto de demanda si volviera a suceder una crisis como esta?
I don't know. So I think when the next earthquake happens in Lima, you probably want your providers to be further away. So I think there is in many countries, there is now a debate where the reasoning is, well, we should actually have all of our suppliers more close by. But actually from a risk perspective, this does not make a lot of sense. Because if this next earthquake happens in Lima, at that point you have nothing available, and then you actually need to get your supplies from maybe the US or China. So I think in general, from a risk management perspective, you want to have multiple suppliers in different locations that you can appeal to at any particular moment in time. So diversify your suppliers, both in terms of location and in terms of different companies. Oh, you're on mute, Michaela.
I was on mute, sorry. Okay, so now we're moving into specific sectors. This question is about the maritime freights, naval freights. About maritime freight, how do you see the trends? What about ships and ports and waiting times? Are there any predictions, and how do you think this might change in Latin America?
Yeah.
So in Spanish, so acerca del transporte marítimo, ¿cómo ves la tendencia sobre el tema de embarques, el tema de puertos, los tiempos estimados de espera? ¿Cómo crees que puede cambiar esto para Latinoamérica?
Yeah. So I would say in general, actually, I talked yesterday to my colleague at KLU, who's a professor of maritime logistics, to get a bit of an update on the status there. It's still a big mess. So the global supply, the global container liner operations is just in disorder. So because so many sailings have been cancelled, so that means ships are in the wrong place from where they should be. Containers are not where they should be. Now, the question then is, there's no reason to believe this will not happen to Latin America. So these problems are also going to happen there. Potentially, but this is speculation from my side. I think potentially, because in general, the services are less direct services in Latin America, but there are more feeder services. It could be that the effect is potentially even bigger, because if you have a feeder service, you're more likely to have less volume, and this may affect at some point the shipping of the feeder service. Right. So this is a speculation from my side, but that could be even stronger the effect as what we have seen in Europe, for instance, now, or in the US for that matter. And the Port of Los Angeles just last month, March, I think they had 1/3 less volume, and effectively this also means fewer sailings of ships. As if you are a shipper and you're using these services, the way this affects you also is with additional lead times, because the frequency of the shipping services go down. So rather than having a service every week or every 2 weeks, it could be that a service is only coming by once a month or every 3 weeks. I think this we will see likely for some time, I think. And some time means multiple months, I think.
Another sector, so now airline industry. Well, given that the airline industry will have a slow recovery, how do you see the air freight shortages going forward over the next 6 months?
Yeah.
Dado que la industria aérea tendrá una recuperación lenta, ¿cómo crees que se maneje la escasez de carga aérea en los próximos 6 meses?
Yeah. We will be extremely dependent on what is going to happen to the passenger air networks, and as I understand the predictions there, this is going to be a very slow ramp up, right? It's not that next month everybody will start flying again as if nothing had happened. There are likely to be many restrictions in place for travel, etc. So probably the ramp up of passenger air capacity is going to be slow, and as most of the freight is on passenger planes, this may also be slow. Having said that, there are quite a few airlines that have converted passenger planes to freight capacity, even just in emergency cases. But they will likely only do this as long as the prices stay very high, right? The other thing that will highly impact so that's the supply side. So I think on the supply side, we'll probably see less capacity being available for an extended period of time. The question then is the demand side. So on the demand for air freight, what we have seen now happening, if China is an indicator, because China's now sort of gone through the recovery, is that there's huge volatility, because let's say sectors that completely close down in terms of demand, they sort of get rid of all of their need for air capacity because they shift to ocean to save cost because they don't need it immediately, etc. Other sectors, and medical supplies is one of them, they are reverse, right? And I think we could be seeing is if the ramp up is happening, we're probably going to see that in some sectors there are shortages, so they're going to need at some moments huge. They have a huge need of air freight capacity, while in others are going to be a shortage. Now, if there is such volatility, in most cases, what economists will tell us is prices will generally increase on this type of volatile market. But there will be periods when it's low. I think we'll see many fluctuations over the coming 6 months, maybe even year. And what makes it difficult if you are a a company in need of air freight capacity. So if I think of the blueberry exports from Peru to Europe, I think what may be difficult is actually to secure a reliable capacity. I think this may be difficult.
Agreed. Thank you. We have one last question, and it's really interesting because it's about the businesses that are still running full force in basic needs, in products for basic needs. So how can a company, which is still operating because it's a producer of essential needs, best respond to the context? Sorry, issue here. Okay. Again, how can a company which is still operating because it is a producer of essential needs best respond to the context considering the excessive consumption and risks? And how could it be ready once the ramp-up starts? So Spanish, ¿cómo una empresa que sigue operando, ya que es proveedor de servicios básicos, puede ahora tener la mejor respuesta para seguir otorgando esos servicios o productos básicos considerando el sobreconsumo y los riesgos? Y cómo también puede estar lista para el ramp-up una vez que llegue el momento.
Yeah. So I think the companies that are producing essential goods, they are currently facing much higher demand than usual. And practices that we have seen here is, like I also mentioned in my talk, is reducing the assortment. So going down in the breadth of the assortment, so having fewer types of cereals or jams or whatever, or packed frozen vegetables or whatever. Reduce your assortment size. That typically increases capacity, both in production and in the distribution channel. So that's a good way to do it now. For these companies, actually, once we start to get into a more normal situation, the ramp up will actually be a ramp down, right? Because once restaurants open, it's likely that supermarkets will start seeing a decrease in demand. So if I'm supplying food or medicine, at some point I will start seeing a decrease in demand. Now, what I think is really critical is to remain very open communication channels with the retailers to manage this ramp down. Because if that's not there, what's likely to happen is, because it will take some time for your production to respond. And if you keep on producing full capacity while the demand has already gone down, you're essentially filling the channel with a huge amount of inventory that may perish or sell slowly, etc. Right? So somehow keeping good contact with the retailers, or if you're a bit further upstream, with all the parties that are in between you and the retailers, and share information about the cumulative inventory that's there in the supply chain. You somehow want to manage that inventory and make sure that doesn't get too much once the sales at the end start decreasing. One thing that may make it a bit easier than the ramp up is that I expect, and I think most people expect this, if we see now what's happening in Austria and the Czech Republic, is that this ramp down will be much slower. So it will not be all of a sudden that everybody will start eating in restaurants, because the restaurant capacity will also be limited, because restaurants will need to observe again this 1.5 meter distance, so they need to have fewer tables. So there are many, and probably people initially will also be a bit scared to go out to restaurants, right? So I think this may take a bit of time, and the ramp down may be a bit slower in that sense.
Perfect. And to clarify for the Spanish speakers,
yeah.
Just to clarify your answer, mencionó el reducing assortment, quiere decir que es un menor surtido, una menor variedad de productos. Okay, sí. No sé si me escuchan bien. Okay, and Jan, just Peruvians, we like to take advantage of the opportunity. So there's one last one, which is, sure. I'll close with that one. Okay.
Don't worry.
This one just appeared on the chat. So from your experience, and I'll ask Jose also to contribute after you, because it touches Peru. From your experience within the Peruvian context, could you please mention the 2 or 3 main learning opportunities for the future in collaborative logistics, including government and health sector and private sector?
Yeah. I think it's a very good question.
Let me read it in Spanish again.
Yeah,
Por,
sure.
en su experiencia
Sorry.
y en el, no, it's okay. Y dentro del contexto de Perú, por favor, si nos puede comentar los 2 o 3 principales aprendizajes para el futuro de logística colaborativa, incluyendo sector privado, gobierno y sector salud.
Yeah. So I think actually in terms, I've been in Peru 2 times last year, visited UTEC, and I really love to be there. And I think also that sometimes collaboration is a bit difficult between companies and between companies and the government. And this crisis could provide an opportunity to actually explore collaboration, because right now collaboration is actually critical. And this implies that, for instance, one of the, let me give a few examples. So one example is that what we see here in Europe now is that many cities, they are relaxing the restrictions on delivery. Because so cities have access restrictions, just like Lima in Peru, for trucks to enter the city. But because there are now in Peru curfews and here in Europe limited opening hours for the stores, effectively it means that the quantities cannot be replenished. So here in Europe, I would say all cities, as far as I can see, they have relaxed these regulations for now. And to allow the capacity to grow during the crisis times. But this provides an opportunity after the crisis to actually have a good discussion and approach this issue from both sides. Because of course, access restrictions are in some way beneficial, maybe for traffic, for other things, but they also pose a limitation on the supply chain and on supplying essential goods, right? So I think that's one example where now during the crisis, I would expect the Lima government to also move into this direction, or would hope. And maybe that's a way to start discussion again. That's one example. A second example is collaboration between companies. There is a very nice example going on in Germany, actually. Because in Germany, the restaurants also have to close. And, oops, can you still hear me? Oh, okay, because it says my speaker is not working. But in Germany, all the restaurants have to close, while the supermarkets, they have much additional demand, so they're in need of workers. And in Germany, McDonald's, they have actually made their staff, rented their staff out to Aldi, which is the largest grocery retailer. So this is a very unusual collaboration, right? For McDonald's to work with Aldi as a grocery retailer. But these 2 companies have now found each other. And I can imagine that these type of combinations could also start to work in regular times. Because I'm sure in regular times, there will also be peaks in grocery sales at periods where maybe in restaurants, there may be slower times. Right, so this type of collaboration is very unusual in Europe, and I think I can imagine that this type of thing, I don't see any reason why this cannot be done also in Peru. These are creative ideas. José.
Yeah, José, dale.
Thank you, Jan. Rápidamente, yo creo que sí, que la crisis es una excelente oportunidad para colaborar, porque lo que hace es tener mucho más que ganar y un objetivo mucho más alto que de lo que normalmente tenemos. Entonces eso hace que nuestros egos o temas de competencia, digamos, sean consideraciones muy secundarias y tomen un asiento de atrás, mientras que la colaboración toma un asiento de frente, ¿no? Yo creo que sí hay muchas cosas que podemos hacer desde la cadena de suministro con el sector salud. Por ejemplo, todo el tema de gamarra que puede reactivarse para hacer mascarillas, Ese es un ejemplo donde se puede colaborar. Perú Compras, por ejemplo, tiene un tema de compras para pymes, para pequeñas empresas. Y yo creo que esas se puede redireccionar un poco ese tema de licitaciones de pequeñas empresas hacia productos que sean esenciales para el sector salud. Otra cosa que un poco lo que decía Jan, entre empresas, gente que tiene, por ejemplo, mucha fuerza laboral, incluyendo operadores logísticos, podría tratar de poner en oferta parte de su personal para otras organizaciones de manera de préstamo. Claro que esto requiere algún tema legal, ¿no? Por supuesto, yo no soy experto, pero por supuesto que se puede usar capacidad de gente para poder contribuir en otras industrias, ¿no? Y inclusive reconvertir ciertas fábricas para hacer productos que se necesiten más, ¿no? Sobre todo para hacer repuestos, por ejemplo. Yo creo que también hay un tema ahí de, no solo de hacer cosas, sino, por ejemplo, de poner un montón de gente disponible para hacer servicios de reparación de equipos en hospitales. Eso es súper importante, ¿no? Y finalmente yo creo que el sector retail mismo podemos hacer muchas colaboraciones. Eso lo puse un poco la lámina, pero por ejemplo, ¿por qué no un supermercado colaborar con las bodegas? Yo creo que eso sí se puede dar en este contexto, dado que los supermercados tienen una capacidad limitada y se necesita aún más. Cuando el gobierno dice solo salen 4 días de 7 días, eso significa que no todo lo puede soportar el supermercado, y más bien ellos podrían apoyar a las bodegas para hacer esto, ¿no? Sí hay un mensaje que darle también un poco al gobierno de que a veces no está considerando el efecto que está generando con sus restricciones en términos de congestión. Eso puede generar problemas para los trabajadores para llegar a su trabajo. Entonces, si el gobierno, por ejemplo, colabora en términos de ok, este es el personal que es esencial y darles como que facilidades y pasos mucho más ágiles, inclusive ayudarlos en caso de una irrupción, puede ayudar mucho a que las empresas críticas en estos momentos no paguen. Gracias, Micaela.
Buenísimo, José. Muchísimas gracias. Jan, many thanks for your inspiring and strong and relevant insights. I think we all take a lot to bring back to work and for a better planning. A los asistentes, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Ha sido una sesión súper interesante. Les pido se tomen un minuto en llenar la encuesta que tenemos para asegurar que las sesiones sean cada vez mejores. Y también quería comentarles que no se pierdan estas próximas sesiones. El 21 de abril tenemos un manejo de crisis y el 23 de abril tenemos el workshop de innovación en supply chain como seguimiento a esta sesión para tener aprendizajes prácticos para llevar a la empresa. Muchísimas gracias, Jan, y a todos, y José, gracias también por la gestión. Tengamos un día maravilloso. Que estén muy bien.
My pleasure. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. A muchos de ustedes los vamos a contactar para un poquito tratar de mapear qué es lo que está sucediendo en las cadenas. Creo que es importante saber más de ustedes y cuál es la situación que están enfrentando. Muchas gracias a todos por venir. Gracias, Micaela. Gracias, Sean. Hasta luego.
Gracias. Que estén bien.
Hasta luego.